In our game today, Capablanca shows us a brilliant knight maneuver, the technique of creating a target and then attacking it, and then finally plays one of his really brilliant endgames that we can't help but get better by going over. His opponent is David Janowski. He technically doesn't have a GM title because he played so long ago, but I think historically there's no doubt he's a grandmaster level player. He was one of the absolute best players in the world. Capablanca has white, Janowski has black. Let us jump right in. Kappa begins with e4, e5, and quickly we get the four knights opening, as you can see here. The four knights are developed. There are a couple of ways white can play this. There are sidelines too, but usually they play d4, the Scotch four knights, or as what Capablanca played in this game, bishop to b5, the Spanish four knights, obviously called the Spanish because you see the same bishop to b5 maneuver. Here, black usually either maintains the symmetry with bishop to b4 or plays knight to d4, which can lead to very complicated play or a quick draw, depending on how it is handled. But Janowski plays a more traditional Spanish approach. He plays a6, asking the bishop, do you want to take the knight or do you want to move back? And Capablanca goes ahead and grabs that knight. And after dc5, dc6, excuse me, we have a position very similar to a Rui Lopez exchange variation, where black has this crippled queenside pawn structure, but in exchange, he also gets the bishop pair. Here, white can take the pawn on e5 here. Black's idea is that he would take back on e4, and after knight e4, queen to d4, attacking those two knights, wins the piece back. However, after just castling, queen takes e5 and d4, rook e1, white has a slight pull in this position, so Capablanca could have played it like that, but instead he goes ahead and just simply castles, and bishop g4 is played by Janowski. Now that knight cannot take on e5, and it is pinned to the queen. So the first thing Capablanca does is play h3, asking the bishop where it wants to go. The bishop goes to h5, and now queen to e2. And in this position, because of that queen, he is threatening g4, followed by knight takes e5, because the queen adds extra support to the e4 pawn, and after g4, if black wanted to, say, sack the knight for the pawn, the queen at e2 allows white to defend that situation well. So he's threatening g4, knight takes e5. So Janowski plays bishop to d6 to defend the e5 pawn. Capablanca simply plays d3. A good option for black in this position would have been knight to d7. Basically, you just play f6, support this e5 pawn, and play with your bishop pair. But instead, Janowski plays queen to e7, where the king can castle short or castle long and maybe create an attacking position on the king's side. Knight to d1 is played by Capablanca. On c3, the knight doesn't have much of a future. So he begins a maneuver routing that knight to a much more effective square. The knight goes to d1, and Janowski does castle long, and knight to e3. And we can see the knight is aiming for the f5 square, a very strong square for the knight. Bishop to g6, Capablanca puts the bishop so that it can take a knight if it lands on the f5 square, but Capablanca plays the knight to h4. So now there are two knights aiming at f5. So if one were to be captured, the other could take it. And now this domination of f5 makes things a little uncomfortable for black. Janowski plays rook h to g8. The idea is when a knight lands on f5, it'll be attacking both the g7 pawn and the queen. So he wants to defend that point. It may look like black can play knight takes e4, grabbing a pawn, and the queen aims at the knight at h4. But in that case, Capablanca would just take the bishop and attack the queen and actually would win a piece here. So rook h to g8, defending the g7 pawn is played by Janowski. The knight hops into that f5 square. The queen moves to e6. And now Capablanca, in one move, begins to activate both rooks and the bishop. He plays the move f4, his primary pawn break here. And now the rooks can play on the f file. The bishop can become active on f4. Bishop takes the knight first at f5. Then knight takes f5 and ef4. Capablanca in the game took the pawn with the bishop He could also have taken on d6 first, giving up that nice knight, but the bishop is much stronger here than the knight on f6, so that would have worked. But he goes ahead and takes with the bishop. Bishop to c5 check, trying to preserve that bishop. Bishop to e3. He's still fine with the exchange. If the bishops are exchanged off, it's not that different than the actual game. But Janowski plays the bishop back to f8. Of course, that helps to defend g7. Also, queen to f2. Capablanca wants the bishops off, so he's aiming at this c5 square where this bishop would have no choice but to be exchanged off. Rook to d7, and then he goes ahead and does that. Bishop to c5. The bishops do come off, and Capablanca is threatening queen to a7, which would cause all sorts of terrible trouble for Black's king. So Janowski plays king to b8 to keep the queen out of that a7 square. And now rook to f2. Capablanca wants to double up on the f file. Maybe he could play knight takes g7, undermining the f6 knight of its defense, and then capture it. So to prevent that, Janowski plays knight to e8 preemptively before that could take place. Rook a to f1 and f6, trying to create a barrier for these rooks to become active along the f file. Black is also threatening to capture on a2, so Capablanca plays b3 to keep that pawn protected. And now knight to d6. Janowski's ready to go into a heavy piece endgame, and Capablanca has no problem with that whatsoever. So he plays rook to f4. He allows the knights to be exchanged, which they are. He takes with the queen. Queen takes queen. Rook takes f5. Now, this is a classic Capablanca rook endgame. This is one of those endgames where you just learn so much when you go over it. This is really something. Basically, White's main strategy here, he wants to play a minority attack with the kingside pawns. Advance to g4, g5, and when this pawn gets traded off, the e pawn will become passed, and then you want to march that up the board and create a weakness also on the king side if you can. So to begin with, rook to e8 was played by Janowski, and now g4, that very minority attack strategy we just talked about. He wants to play g5 and leave this pawn at e4 completely passed. b6, Black wants to play king to b7, c5, and then king to c6 to activate the king. The next move from Capablanca, again, brilliantly instructive, b4. So now, if Black were to play a5 or c5, he would take with his pawn and create pawn weaknesses all over the queen's side. So Black really can't play a5 or c5 right now. He plays king to b7, king to f2. Capablanca begins to centralize his king. And here, b5 was played by Janowski, but that does sort of create a weakness on c5. A better option might have been rook to a8, and then you can play a5 when it's supported by the rook. b5. Now, another brilliant idea from Capablanca. He plays a4, an amazing move. If the pawn is taken, then rook to a1, and look at all these pawn weaknesses. White's just going to take on a4. Black is in huge trouble. Rook to d4 was played in the game, attacking the b4 pawn. But then rook to b1 defends it, and now rook to e5. And it would be a mistake here to just take that rook, and here Black is probably okay. So instead, Capablanca plays king to e3, attacking the rook at d4. And here, if Janowski takes on f5, you could just take with the g pawn. And what happens after the rook moves, a5, and Capablanca is going to play the rook to g1 and attack g7, and then advance d4, e5, and just roll these central pawns forward. So he doesn't want to take there. So he moves the rook back. Now a5. Now what he's doing here is fixing a weakness. This a6 pawn is a target, which means if this king were to ever try to get away, then a rook might be able to come to a8 and capture that pawn. And that's a real problem for Janowski as the game progresses. Rook to e6 was played, rook b to f1, rook d to e7, and now finally the minority attack, g5, attacking that f6 pawn. He really needs to take on g5. Rook takes. Now rook to h6, attacking h3. The rook comes back, but we can see these pawns are ready to roll. d4, e5. The e pawn is now passed. So Janowski comes back. So now the e pawn and the d pawn can't move at the moment. h4. Capablanca wants to advance this pawn and create a further weakness on the king side. g6, rook to g5 to support that h5 push. h6, the rook has to come back. And now he's threatening rook f8, rook g8, and the g pawn would be lost. So black plays rook to g7 immediately. But now Capablanca's central pawns can advance. So he plays d4. Those pawns begin to roll. King to c8. Now rook to f8 check. And the king goes to d7. Then rook to a8, going after that weakness Capablanca created earlier. Really strong stuff. So the king now has to go back to b7. E5 is played. Those pawns advance. G5. And king moves up to e4. There's a pin on the g pawn, so he doesn't have to worry about black taking on h4. The rook goes to e7, but now hg5, hg5, and the minority attack not only has passed the pawn at e5, but created an isolated pawn for black at g5, which Capablanca quickly wins with rook to f5. The king goes to c8. He takes that pawn. Rook to h7. He wants to activate on the h file, but Capablanca prevents that from happening. If he plays rook h to g7, then rook to h8 check. Again, the king would have to go back to protect a6, but then rook ff8, and these rooks are coming in. And in fact, this would lead to a forced mate. Those two rooks are not going to be able to stop. They won't be able to prevent a mate if the pawn goes to c5, and this pawn would advance and keep the king bottled up. So the king goes to d7, rook takes, and rook to f8. Again, going after that weakness on a6. Rook to h4 check. There's a series of checks here. If he continues checking, what Capablanca does is he just hides his king on b2, and rook a8, rook a6 is unstoppable. So instead of that, Janowski sort of lashes out with c5. Capablanca can take either way. If he takes with the d pawn, he isolates his e pawn. Still better. But he takes with the b pawn first. Janowski plays rook to a3 to take the now undefended a pawn. But after Capablanca plays d5, Janowski resigns because it's clearly over. He's going to play rook to f7 check. The king has to move back, and these pawns are simply just going to roll forward. There's nothing black can do. A masterpiece from the great Capablanca. This endgame is worth playing over and over again to look at all the little subtleties and things that Capablanca did. Truly amazing. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.